a Kangaroofern production.
It shows how arrogant this bloke is. That's what it shows. But we'll continue to pursue. He had a loss in the legal system last night with this interim decision, and we will back the E-Safety Commissioner, as I'm sure every parliamentarian will. And Mr Musk should be very conscious of the fact that Australians are united on this issue.
Hello, everyone. This is MIKO'S, and welcome to the Freeman Chronicle podcast. On today's episode, we're talking about this clash between Australian government and some social media platform like Twitter or X. So, as of earlier, I think last night, the E-Safety Commissioner has filed order in the federal court to remove some of the graphic image that's still in X. On today's episode, we'll talk to Dr. Faith Gordon. She is an associate professor in law and deputy associate dean of research at the ANU College of Law. Hi, doctor. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here to talk with you about these issues.
My first question to you is that what motivated Australian government to propose this tougher penalty for social media
Well,
company?
these discussions we've been having for quite a number of years, really globally, about social media companies, about misinformation and disinformation, about, should we regulate, should we legislate? How can we bring social media companies more in line, particularly when there are these very high profile incidences that do occur, and we need in some way to have mechanisms to have really swift action, for example, to remove materials that, are damaging to, their sharing and resharing and viewing is particularly damaging. So, that's one such example of why we do need some sort of a mechanism in place to ensure that there is swift action when we need social media companies to take action, that it happens swiftly. And launching legal proceedings, injunctions, it can be quite a lengthy process. We are very fortunate in Australia that we do have the e-safety commissioner's office, and her office has very good legislation and mechanisms that they can utilize, but still, the delay, the time it takes, the compliance or lack of compliance from social media companies all can have a big impact when content keeps getting shared and reshared and viewed online, and the reach of that, of course, it is major. So it's important that we do have the right regulation and laws in place should we need to use those. But also, we do need to do what the Prime Minister has called upon the social media companies to do, in that they should be much more socially aware of their role in misinformation and spreading that to large numbers. So that social responsibility aspect is a really key point that Prime Minister Albanese has also outlined in his discussions on this topic recently.
So, so e-safety commissioner went to the court to order to remove this this stabbing incident on last week. So we're talking to three three topic on this one. The government want to remove this particular video to X, but what about they say information and disinformation law? So that's totally three separate topics.
Well, it's a very, very difficult and complex area to, in effect, place the platforms in relation to the sheer volume of, information content imagery, videos that are shared online. It's a really tricky area and problem. However, if it is left unmonitored and unchecked, there are all sorts of, pieces of information that just aren't factually accurate that are being shared, and people are relying upon this information to make key decisions. And we've seen that really quite starkly during the COVID-19 pandemic. That really shone a light onto the power that these platforms have in the sharing of information that really about the vaccine, about COVID itself, about treatment. So that term fake news really came to prominence several years ago, but it's really important because in relation to public health, in relation to safety, we've also seen it in relation to integrity with regards to the electoral systems, but also more broadly when certain groups, social groups, have been pinpointed as being a particular problem or an outsider. That also affects our cohesion within our society. So there are major risks to our democracy by misinformation and disinformation, known as fake news. What we've seen really interestingly is that this generation of young people are much more aware of fake news and the need to fact check their information, their need to engage with a range of sources before they make up their mind. And I've done some direct research with young people who they do have this awareness compared to other generations, much more so, about fake news and the dangers of that. But if people are relying upon it to make decisions, it's really significant that there is some sort of a monitor check. But what we must ensure is that we don't encroach on freedom of expression, which is a really important right that we have in a democracy. But there does need to be, for safety reasons, a check or monitor over information also, without encroaching or breaching too much on freedom of expression. But it is a balancing act.
So we already have Online Safety Act. How would the proposed law impact the social media platform that fails to remove misleading content?
Well, this discussion has come up before in Australia, and there has been, a lot of discussion and debate about, what measures are the most appropriate. We know that social media companies make a lot of money from what they do. And in research that I have conducted, particularly in relation to children and online harms and the lack of redress that they have received following issues that have occurred on platforms, we know that a lot slips through the net in relation to social media platforms. Their inaction, the delay, the very slow process, the fact that initially the e-safety commissioner, a complaint needs to be made, then they need to interact with the company. Some companies do and are reported as being better than others in removing content or addressing issues. However, some other platforms are reported as being particularly slow, and what occurs then is often the need to engage in the legal apparatus that we have, through, injunctions and the like, which involves the courts. And that is, often can be a protracted process. And in the meantime, as I mentioned earlier, you've got the sharing, resharing, the engagement with the material in society. So, any delay really does have a knock-on effect in this area. Another aspect when we're talking about, evolving the law and regulation in this space is that, did platforms Technology is always evolving. So we do need to ensure that while it's difficult to keep one step ahead of all of the developments that we have, we do need to be, have an element of, flexibility and, react to the changes that we see. And it is important that consultation is done with, wider society, the platforms, the service providers, the service users. And that's something that, the platforms themselves have been quite critical of the government when this discussion has come up previously, that there was a lack of consultation. It is something that the government needs to be mindful of in bringing the platforms on a journey with them, to see the best possible results, because at the end of the day, we need compliance on this, and it's much better to have regular compliance than having to rely on fining companies, because companies can often quite afford the fines because they make a lot of money. But at that point, the damage has already been done. So we do need to see a lot more partnership work happening, and that may actually address some of the issues much quicker than it getting to the stage of having to fine a company a large amount of money.
So what's gonna be the impact of this to the company?
Well, there have been discussions before about, even sometimes custodial sentences being, served on platform providers if they do not comply. But that would obviously be sort of a last resort option. Fining is used in other jurisdictions. Some other countries have, made changes to their criminal law, for example, to hold those in managerial levels, at the top levels, compliant. We are seeing a lot more bipartisan support at the moment, following two very major incidences in Australia where, there was footage of, violence that had occurred, and very sadly, the tragic deaths of members of our community. And these sort of events, and we've seen this, with regard to New Zealand and the Christchurch attacks as well. At that time, Australia really was having these discussions also in relation to, what needs to be brought in place to see swifter action from the companies. But what we're seeing is, some debate and discussion happening. And at that time, a number of years ago, even the Law Council of Australia's president was calling upon the government not to make a knee-jerk reaction in terms of, following a very tragic event and bringing in, new laws that may have, particularly unintended consequences. So it is an area where, the government do need to properly consult. They do need to bring people on a journey with them, and that also does include the social media platforms themselves.
Thank you so much for that. What's gonna be the role of does freedom of speech about this?
Well, there is a real danger that we could see quite a chilling, what's known as a chilling effect on free speech, which in many ways would, as some commentators or critics would call it, would be a form of potential censorship, which of course we don't want to see in a democracy like Australia, where we are very fortunate that we do have, a lot of diversity, in our views and perspectives, and there is that, democratic underpinning that we should be able to air those. But we do need a balancing effect, and that is important. This balancing act is really, really important. we do need oversight, we do need regulation, but we also need to ensure that, we don't have, too much, because that would impact on society's, you know, ability, people in society to be free in what they say. We don't want to see what's happened in some other countries where people, are unfortunately censored to a very high degree, and that's been one of the criticisms, really. What we often see discussed in this space as well is sort of a form of co-regulation. It's quite clear that companies cannot self-regulate. That has not worked, and it hasn't worked in other jurisdictions as well. What is challenging is, these companies are international businesses, and while we may have a set of, regulations and rules in Australia, if this content is shared and reshared and discussed on forums internationally, like, it's very difficult, um, because you're engaging and having to engage in, the law in that specific country if you need to get the content removed. This is why we do need the buy-in of the social media companies, within their, policy responses, to have the content removed, without having to go through the legal processes, is the most ideal approach.
Thank you so much for that. How do you think the Australian current social media law compared to other developed nation?
Well, we do know that, the proposed changes that are being made at the moment would bring Australia a bit more in line with Europe. Europe does seem to be the jurisdiction that most people look to for having, more effective regulation and law. We do know that, in relation to sort of fake information, countries such as, for example, Russia, did bring in amendments to their criminal code a couple of years ago, which, stipulated that there would be jail terms for those. But we know that that has been heavily criticized in relation to, suppressing particular pieces of information and debates and discussions. So we wouldn't want to see things go to those extreme measures. But the what we do have, we have had since 2021 this voluntary code of practice on disinformation and misinformation in Australia, which was developed for digital platforms, by their industry association. But as we do know, self-regulation is not enough. We do need to have, something else in place, because it hasn't been, wholly effective. And, when ownership of these companies changes, which we've seen with X, that brings in a whole different approach. And it is, very reliant on the personality and the approach of the ownership. So the proposed legislation would give the Australian Communications and Media Authority much more power over the social media platforms, which could well help address the type of response that we've seen from certain social media companies, which has been huge inaction and huge delay.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Fate. My last question to you is, how might this law set a benchmark for the rest of the world in addressing misinformation or violent materials online?
Australia very much is a leader in the space of, e-safety. We are looked to as a country for having, strong legislation, a very active e-safety commissioner, who, had previous industry experience, and does present as having excellent relations with social media companies. So we are looked to as a leader in the safety, space, and that legislation again in the last few years has been, has evolved more to give her office more powers. So that is an excellent model that we have in Australia. But we do need, and there are lots of discussions in various areas that we are having and have been having for the last number of years that do need to evolve and develop, about data, for example, and data sovereignty and privacy law, etc. So there are areas where Australia does need to evolve and develop and come into much more in line perhaps with what Europe has been doing in these spaces. So these discussions are really important that we're having. It's positive to see that there has been bipartisan support. We don't want to see a knee-jerk reaction. We do need to see consultation occurring, and experts that are working in the space can be utilized to assist in that balancing act between, we don't want to see censorship and an erosion of freedom of expression, but we also have a duty to ensure that misinformation, disinformation, violent, extremely violent content is removed swiftly. Content that's going to be damaging to community. I know through my direct research with children and young people the ramifications of that content for them. That's been reported in widely in my research, and the long-term consequences of having viewed material, but also of having inaction from the companies when they've made complaints. So, when we do think about, the most impressionable members of our society, the most vulnerable members of our society, these laws should protect them and ensure that their best interests are, protected and promoted without constraining their use of platforms.